Welcome. This lecture is on reinforcement. So we'll discuss the law of effect, we'll define reinforcement, positive and negative reinforcement, and discuss the theories of how and why reinforcement works. First, let's start with one of the major players in this area, Edward Thorndike. Edward Thorndike was the son of a Methodist minister. He earned his master's degree under William James, the founder of American psychology, at Harvard, and he earned his PhD under James Cattell at Columbia, earned it at age 23. His primary interest, though, was in education and measurement, and so his career took place at the Teachers College at Columbia University. His research, though, began while he was working with William James, and it was on the question of animal intelligence. So the psychology department at Harvard didn't have an animal facility really at the time, and so the only space that he could have was in the basement at William James's house, where he began testing chicks running through mazes. When he went to Columbia, he continued to do his research in the attic of the psychology department, and there is where he developed these puzzle boxes. Essentially, it's this box that he constructed out of scrap wood, but there were little levers and latches, and the cats could activate the latch to open a door, and the door would fall open, and then the cat could come out and eat a little bit of food. Later, he did similar kinds of tests with dogs and monkeys. That, in the case of monkeys, they had a puzzle box, but rather than get out of it, they had to figure out how to get into it and get the food that was hidden inside. I invite you to watch the YouTube video, the reenactment, essentially, of Thorndike, and so you can see how the puzzle box worked and get a little bit of overview of the work that he was doing. Please pause the lecture and watch that video, and then come on back to the lecture. What Thorndike discovered then is what he called the law of effect. He said responses which are closely followed by satisfaction to the animal will be more firmly connected with the situation, so that when the situation, reoccurs, they, the responses, will be more likely to reoccur. So, 3 things here that he's pointing out. Behavior followed by satisfaction in a situation. Right? So 3 parts: the situation, the behavior that happens there, and the consequences. He followed that by saying responses which are closely followed by discomfort to the animal will have their connections with the situation weakened, so that when the situation recurs, the responses will be less likely to occur. So he's arguing about this relationship between these 3 important components of situation, behavior, and consequences. He went on to argue that we learn, and that all animals learn, by success. Right? He watched his cats work in the puzzle box and watched them claw and just do all these different kinds of things, and from all of these different things they did, one of them eventually was to trip the lever, right? And the door would fall open. And then the next time you put them in the puzzle box, they were more likely to do the things that led up to the door falling open. And so what he argued is that from all of these different movements, the right one, the correct one, is selected by success. So he argued for trial and success learning, not trial and error. In other words, he would argue that we don't really learn anything from errors. What we learn from is success. B.F. Skinner picked up from Thorndike's work. So he began as a student in English. He wanted to become a writer, but he became fascinated by psychology and went to graduate school in psychology. and developed what we now see as the natural science of behavior. He contributed both to the scientific and popular literature. He wrote a lot of books. He was prolific. And in 2001, he was voted by members of the APA, most of whom are clinical psychologists. He was voted as the most important psychologist of the 20th century. What did he do that would make him so important? Well, he developed the operant chamber, which we will look at in more detail on the next slide, and ways of recording behavior. He developed the philosophy of behaviorism and applied his scientific findings to real-world issues, including education, parenting, animal training, and even politics and communities, and to criminal justice, etc. And he really developed behaviorism and the natural science of behavior. So here is the Skinner box. The reason why he developed this, or the operant chamber as he called it, the reason why he developed this is because he wanted to study behavior without interruption. With Thorndike put a cat in a box, the cat got out, and then that was the end of a trial. And so Thorndike would have to reset everything, pick the cat up, put the cat back inside. And so every trial was interrupted by the experimenter, by Thorndike. And with a maze, it's the same thing. You put the animal in the maze, and they run through it, and then you got to pick them up and put them back at the start again. And each time they run through, that's one trial, right? That's one run. What Skinner wanted to do is look at behavior unfold in time without those kinds of interruptions. And so the operant chamber was a way to do that. You put a lever in there, you have a way to give them food or water or both, and so they can do things and have consequences to their behavior without the experimenter having to interrupt them. But if you're going to do that, then you need another way of measuring that behavior. And so the way he measured that was the development of the cumulative record. On each of these graphs, what we're looking at is on the y-axis, we see number of responses. On the x-axis, we see time in minutes. And so think about this as kind of like a polygraph or a seismograph, where the paper is like moving along at a constant rate. It's just feeding the paper through, and there's a pen that's writing on the paper. And so if nothing's happening, the pen is just drawing a straight line down the page. But if there is an event, then the pen moves on the paper. It's kind of like that, except that in this case, every time there's a response, then the pen moves up by one notch. So every time the rat presses the lever, then the pen moves up by one notch. So if we look in this area, we see that the line is flat. That means that no responses are occurring during that time. And during this area, we see that there are a lot of responses going on at that time. And so by using a cumulative record, it allowed us to see behavior unfold and be able to look at rate of responding as it was happening. So the way Skinner talked about operant behavior or voluntary behavior is that it's behavior that changes the environment. It operates on the environment. And similar to Thorndike's law of effect, behavior argued that operant behavior, what makes it operant is that we're looking at a change in the likelihood of behavior due to its consequences. So still looking at behavior, consequences, and the situation in which the animal is in. As I already described, the way Thorndike did research was through these discrete trials. Each time the animal was put into a maze or into a puzzle box, that was one trial, and it had a beginning and an end, and he kept track of how long they were there. Whereas for Skinner, he was looking at what he called a free operant, this behavior uninterrupted. And so they could just respond, and then we can look at response rates and see frequency of responding, and also begin to look at other things like choice. So what is reinforcement? Well, let's define a reinforcer. a reinforcer is a stimulus or event that increases or maintains the strength of the behavior that produces that consequence, that stimulus. So there are three requirements then. One is that we're talking about behavior that has consequences. So we're not talking about behavior that's just a reaction to things, right? When we were talking about Pavlovian conditioning, we were talking about behavior as a reaction. Here we're talking about behavior that does stuff, right? Behavior that changes the environment. We're talking about voluntary behavior, behavior that has consequences. If it's reinforcement, then it has to be behavior that has consequences, and the behavior has to increase in strength. So unless the behavior occurs more often, then the phenomena that we see is not reinforcement. And then lastly, that increase in strength has to be due to the consequences. If any of those three things is not true, then what we're talking about is something different from reinforcement. So let's pause for a second and compare Pavlovian and operant conditioning. One of them is arguably more passive, the other arguably more active learning. Pavlovian conditioning involves pairing of stimuli, right? The experimenter or the environment pairs a CS, a conditioned stimulus, and a US. These stimuli are being paired at the subject. So that means that it proceeds independent of anything that the subject does. Right? The subject could be doing anything, and a tone can come on and they can get shocked, or a bell could ring and they can be given food. They don't have to do anything. Whereas for operant conditioning, it pairs a behavior and a consequence. In other words, in operant conditioning, the subject has to do something in order to get the consequence. So it requires that the subject be active. And the whole process depends on the subject's behavior. Many times people say, like, old dogs can't learn new tricks, that puppies are faster learners. Part of the reason why is because puppies are more active. They do more stuff. And the older the dog gets, the less stuff it does. It's hard to train behavior when the subject isn't behaving. They need to do things in order to come into contact with the consequences. One of them is more involuntary, the other more voluntary. Which is which? Well, Pavlovian conditioning involves involuntary responses, right? These reflexive reactions. Whereas operant behavior involves voluntary behavior, so more complex behavior. This is basically the difference between a blink and a wink, right? We blink if there's a puff of air at us, or we wink to signal something to somebody, right? And it's the difference between salivation and eating. We salivate when we smell something or when there's something put in our mouth, but eating is an activity. It's something that we do, we engage in. So salivation, an example of Pavlovian, involuntary, whereas eating is an example of voluntary, operant. Some more comparisons. In Pavlovian conditioning, we talk about the CS and the US. The CS-US pair is the fundamental unit. That it came down to stimulus-stimulus pairing, CS-US pairing. In operant conditioning, though, we're interested in three things. Remember the law of effect: the situation, the response, the behavior, and the consequences. So one way in which this is discussed is in the ABCs. That the A is the antecedent, the context, the B stands for the behavior, and the C stands for the consequence. A more formal way of doing this, of notating this, is the SD, the R, and the SR plus, where SD stands for the discriminative stimulus. That's the context. That's the part of the context that makes that situation unique or different. The response, it has a little 1 next to it because it's one response out of the hundreds of thousands or millions of things that the subject could do. This is the one that matters. And it's this one response that produces the consequence, the SR plus, the reinforcer. Right? So the formal notation then is that in the presence of the SD, this response is reinforced. Now let's talk about reinforcers. We can divide these up into primary and secondary reinforcers. A primary reinforcer, which our formal notation has that as an S capital R plus, these are stimuli that are naturally or innately important to us, innately reinforcing, if you will. So food, water, sexual stimulation, heat, cold, etc. These are things that are naturally, innately important to us. Secondary or conditioned reinforcers, in our notation that's S lowercase r plus, these are stimuli that have been paired with primary reinforcers. All right. So what are some examples of things that have been paired with primary reinforcers? Well, points, whether that's that we earn them in a game or what have you, or earn points on an assessment, grades, and money. These are all things that have been paired with the attaining of primary reinforcers. And money is often referred to as a generalized reinforcer because money gets paired with everything. You can buy every primary reinforcer if you have enough money. So, which are more effective for learning, primary reinforcers or secondary reinforcers? Note that primary reinforcers are situation dependent. Food is a great reinforcer if you're hungry. If you're not hungry, then maybe not, right? And heat is a good reinforcer if you're not already hot. So in order for primary reinforcers to be effective, we have to make them effective through what are called motivating operations. In other words, in order for food to be effective, one has to be hungry. In order for water to be an effective reinforcer, one has to be thirsty. Right? So these things need to be deprived in order for them to be effective. Here's an example of that. We're looking at the days that rats had the opportunity to run a maze and the errors that they made. And we can see that if a rat is food deprived and they get food at the end of the maze, then they do a lot better across days. They make fewer and fewer errors across the 17 days. But rats that are not food deprived, in other words, these are rats that are fed before going into the maze, and they get food at the end of the maze too, but I mean they're fed before, so they're not hungry, and we see that they continue to make a lot of errors. So in order for primary reinforcers to be effective, one has to use motivating operations. One has to essentially deprive those reinforcers of the subject first. Primary reinforcers can also satiate. We can eat enough food and then we're done eating food. We're good for now, right? Every one of those things, we can get too hot. We can have too much water. We can have too much cold. We can have too much sex, for that matter. All of those things are things that we can be done with, right? We can satiate. Is that the same for secondary reinforcers? How much money is too much? At what point are you just done having money? The other thing about conditioned reinforcers is that they can be delivered quickly and often. So they can be delivered and it doesn't take any time. The subject doesn't have to consume a point. They got the point, they see they got the point, and then they keep working. right? If they're getting money, then they got the money, they say they got the money, and they keep working. Whereas if you're giving them food, well, then they're going to stop and eat the food, and that can interrupt learning, interrupt performance. So conditioned reinforcers don't disrupt behavior. They can reinforce behavior without getting in the way of it. So which are more effective? It depends. Each one is effective in the right situation. Now we're getting into things that affect whether reinforcement works. So contiguity. This is something that we discussed before. This was, it means nearness in time and space, right? Things close together. In the case of operant conditioning, what it's referring to is the time between a response and the consequence. How long between when the behavior occurs and the reinforcer occurs? What is the delay? And what effect does that have? So Schlinger and Blakely studied this in particular. They manipulated the time between when a response occurred and when the reinforcer occurred. All right? And there were 3 conditions here, so 3 different groups. 0 second, meaning no delay, that when the rat pressed the lever, the food was immediately delivered. The 4-second delay meant that when the rat pressed the lever, it took 4 seconds before food was delivered. And a 10-second delay, they pressed the lever, and then it was 10 seconds until food was delivered. They could continue to press the lever in the meantime, by the way, but whenever they pressed it, there was going to be a 10-second delay, or a 4-second delay, or a 0-second delay for when the consequence would be delivered. And what we're looking at then is the cumulative responses. So this will show us the rate of responding. So on the graph, we see that we're looking at 2-minute time periods across the x-axis. So it's a total of 60 minutes that we're looking at, actually. And the mean cumulative responses. So this is overall, on average, the response rate for each one of these groups. We'll start with the 0-second delay. So this is essentially like a control group. We see that over the first 20 minutes they're responding very rapidly, and then over the remaining time, then there's still a very high continuous rate of responding. So overall, though, over the course of an hour, there's almost 200 responses made for each of the rats in that group. What about just a 4-second delay? So delaying reinforcement by only 4 seconds had a dramatic impact on the number of responses. At the end of an hour, there were only up to around 100 responses. They could respond just as much as the 0-second delay group, but by having that delay between the response and the consequence, it dramatically decreased their response rate. And so what that means is that group, even though they were hungry, they got less food than the 0-second delay group. And if you have a 10-second delay, as you might suspect, that would decrease responding even more. And in fact, it did. These ones, at the end of 60 minutes, had barely pressed the lever, on average maybe 15 times. So at the end of 60 minutes, these rats are pretty much just as hungry as they were in the beginning. Why would having a delay between the response and the consequence produce such a dramatic effect? So the general rule here is that the shorter the interval, the faster the learning. As we can see with 0-second delay, so essentially as soon as the response was made, the consequence happened, the food was delivered, they learned rapidly, responded a lot. But if there's a 10-second delay, then they did not really respond at all. So the shorter interval produces faster learning. The shorter interval maintains behavior. Why? Now you might be tempted to say, well, it's easier for the animal to pair the two together. But keep in mind, that's a circular explanation, and we're trying really hard not to do that. So what is it about the interval If it's a 0-second delay, that means that as soon as the response was made, the consequence happened. So nothing else could happen in between those two things, right? If the rat presses the lever and as soon as it does so, clink, there's some food, then the rat doesn't have a chance to do anything else between the lever press and getting food. But if it's a 4-second delay, the rat can press the lever and can turn around, look behind it, scratch itself a little bit, and then the food, clink, drops down. So then the rat eats the food. What is it going to do after that? Is it going to go back to the lever, or is it going to do the thing it was just doing before getting food? Yeah. More likely to do what they were just doing before the food arrived. So the reason why a short delay is better, so essentially no delay, immediacy is best, because other behaviors can occur during the delay. And any behavior that occurs during the delay might get accidentally reinforced. And that means then that the animal will be more likely to do those things instead of the thing that actually produced the food, produced the consequence. So immediacy of reinforcement is important. Contingency. We talked about contingency before. It's that if-then relationship, right? In operant conditioning, we're talking about the degree to which the consequence depends on the response. So that relationship between the response and consequence. In other words, does the response cause the consequence? And in the absence of a response, does the consequence happen? So another way of saying this, let's look at this as an example, right? When the rat presses the lever, does it get the food? And when the rat doesn't press the lever, does it get the food? If we have high contingency, that means that every time the rat presses the lever, it gets food, and any time the rat doesn't press the lever, it doesn't get food, right? So there's a strong relationship between the response and consequence. So Hammond looked at this using an AB-AB design. We talked about this in the previous module. In this case, they adjusted the contingency, that relationship between response and consequence. They started with a moderate contingency, and what this means then is that although not every response produced food, the rat had to respond to get food. So not responding meant no food, but not every response produced food. So it was a moderate contingency, but it's a contingency that we can see produced a lot of responding. We're looking at the average number of responses per hour for each of these sessions, and we see that these rats are doing right around 300 or 3,500 responses per hour. So that's producing a really high rate of behavior. Once established, so we see that those rats are producing a high rate of behavior, then they move the rats to a zero contingency. Zero contingency means that if the rat presses the lever, they're just as likely to get food as if they didn't press the lever. So food delivery is independent of lever pressing. All right, there's no contingency between them. They press the lever, they might get food. If they don't press the lever, well, they still might get food. So under zero contingency, what do you think happened to behavior? Do you think they would continue to respond? Keep in mind, if they respond, they're still going to get food. But if they don't respond, they're still going to get food. So the relationship has gone away. And what we see is that when they were shifted to the zero contingency, responding very quickly went away. So they switched them back to the moderate contingency, and we see responding went back up, and switched them back to the zero contingency, and responding dropped right back down. So the contingency between response and consequence is critically important. If the response isn't necessary for the consequence to occur, then the response will go away. So the general rule here is breaking that response consequence contingency totally disrupts behavior. Now we can get into more of a definition of reinforcement. Reinforcement, by definition, increases the rate of the response upon which it is contingent. Right? Now, there are two different types of contingencies that we can talk about, though. First, positive reinforcement, and the other, negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement. This is when we have something added as a consequence of the response. Right? It's a stimulus or event, the appearance of which increases or maintains the rate of the response upon which it is contingent. What does that mean? Well, this is what's generally referred to as reward or reward learning. Right? However, Skinner argued that people are rewarded, but behavior is reinforced. In other words, things that we think of as rewards are not necessarily reinforcers. Right? And not all reinforcers are rewards. But examples of positive reinforcers are things like when you do something and you get praise or attention or food, right? The rat presses the lever and gets food. Something's added. There wasn't food there. The rat pressed the lever, and as a result of that, now there is. Right? That's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcer means that something is there and now it's removed. So it's a stimulus or event, the removal of which increases or maintains the rate of the response. This is also known as escape and avoidance learning. So think negative reinforcer, escape. Negative reinforcer, escape. It's the same thing. There's a stimulus present, and then you do something and it makes that stimulus go away. All right? So an example of this might be that it's hot, and so you go inside, and now you're not so hot, right? Assuming you have air conditioning inside. Or something is noisy, the TV is up too loud, and you push a button, and now it's not so loud, right? You're avoiding, you're escaping this aversive stimulus. Keep in mind, negative reinforcement is not punishment. Right? Punishment deals with decreasing the rate of behavior. Negative reinforcement deals with increasing the rate of behavior. Behavior is strengthened. Another very common example of negative reinforcement is seatbelt alarms. When you start your car, if you don't have your seatbelt on, then it chimes or dings or buzzes at you, and when you click your seatbelt in, then that chime goes away. Right? By clicking your seatbelt, it gets rid of that noise. Right? That's negative reinforcement. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the brain. And by a little bit, I mean a little bit. This is the extent of our brain talk in this class. So, the reward pathway. This is the pathway involved in reinforcement and operant learning. So this is part of the limbic system, meaning this is part of our old brain. Like this is part of the brain that we have in common with all other mammals and really all other animals, including reptiles. So we're talking about deep structures, all right? These are the dopamine areas of the brain, the dopamine pathway. So the blue areas on the figure. As you can see, the functions are reward, pleasure, euphoria, motor control, compulsion, and perseveration. Think about what reinforcement means. It means strengthening a response, making that response more likely, right? Persevering, keeping a response going. That's the function of the dopamine pathway. So in particular, it deals with the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. Both of these deep brain structures are really important for operant conditioning. Direct stimulation, so direct electrical stimulation to these areas produces euphoric effects. If they're electrically stimulated, you feel good. Reinforcers stimulate this pathway. So, earning praise and completing assignments even activates this pathway. Things that really activate it, surprises, right? Reinforcers, positive things that happen and you didn't know they were going to. So that's what makes birthday presents so fun. You don't know what's in there, and you open it up and whoo, here's this thing and you didn't know it was there, and that's so exciting, right? Way more exciting than when you already know what's there. Of course, that's also what makes gambling so exciting. Because you never know if you're going to win, and when you do, whew, it's exciting. And it stimulates this pathway and makes gambling behavior more persistent. Of course, most addictive drugs are also activate the dopamine system. They activate these areas. So cocaine, opiates, nicotine, and ethanol, so alcohol that we drink, all activate this system. All of them addictive substances. They produce the reward and pleasure by activating that system. But the real issue here is that taking those drugs, the behavior of taking those drugs gets reinforced and leads to these compulsive, perseverative behaviors that we describe as addictions. Addictiveness, though, is not purely because of the system that they're activating. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. We also need to think about the time frame, right? The contiguity of taking a drug and its effect on the brain. So what is the time frame of that? Drugs. So let's think about cocaine, right? Cocaine is administered in a lot of different ways. Some ways get cocaine to the brain faster than other ways. So what is the fastest way to get a drug to the brain? Well, you might think injection. As it turns out, that's not really the case. Say you inject a drug intravenously into your arm. Well, then it has to travel through the bloodstream, to the heart, to the lungs, to the heart, and then finally to the brain. It can take, a good 30 seconds or so. What's faster is smoking the drug. If the drug is inhaled, then it goes into the lungs, is absorbed, goes into the heart, and straight to the brain, and the drug can reach the brain in 7 seconds. And that is why when crack came out in the 1980s, people who understood this got really worried and knew that there would be an epidemic on the hands, because it took something that was taking several minutes to reach the brain and now made it only a few seconds. And that made it a much more addictive and much more dangerous drug. So to understand drugs, we need to understand behavior, because rather than think about drugs and addiction as a purely medical issue, we really need to think about it as a behavioral issue and think about the behavior of drug taking and the consequences of drug taking. And I will close with this. We live on the edge of toxicity. That is a quote from one of the professors that I had in graduate school that just kind of stuck with me. We live on the edge of toxicity. If we have high levels of dopamine in our system, then we have schizophrenic type reactions, psychosis. But if our dopamine levels are really low, then we have Parkinsonian-like symptoms. We need to stay right in the middle, in the Goldilocks zone. Right? And so that is the risk that we always run if we ever are using any substances, that we can push ourselves out of the Goldilocks zone. We need to stay within the realm of healthy. Alright, we've made it to theories of reinforcement, attempts to explain why reinforcement works. The first is the drive reduction theory as developed by Clark Hull. In a nutshell, drive reduction theory argues that reinforcement works because it reduces drives. Alright, what does that mean? Well, it means that, according to Clark Hull, there are innate drives. We have innate needs for food, water, sleep, oxygen, sex, etc. Alright, these are built in. And so we get hungry, we get thirsty, we get tired, we need to breathe, and have sex, etc. So the reason, according to this theory, that reinforcers work is that they reduce these drives. When we're hungry, we eat food, and it reduces our hunger drive. When we're thirsty, we drink water, and that reduces our thirst drive, etc. So it's a fairly straightforward idea of why reinforcers work. However, it is not without its criticisms. As it turns out, not all reinforcers are primary reinforcers. There are a lot of consequences to our behaviors that don't seem to reduce any drives, and there are a lot of things that we do that don't produce primary reinforcers, right? So lots of things don't actually reduce these drives, and there are too many reinforcers that don't reduce drives, and they're not even associated with primary reinforcers. Think about how much time Americans watch TV. We watch a lot of TV. And what does that get us? Oftentimes, we can watch TV and be hungry, not get food, right? We might watch TV and not have sex, like watch TV instead, or play video games, or like get stuck doing something and we're engaged in this activity to the extent that we don't eat or we don't sleep, we stay up too late, right? We're tired, but we keep doing this anyway. Why? That's a great question. That's kind of what the theory needs to address, is why would we continue to do these things that are actually depriving us of our basic needs? And drive reduction theory really fails to account for those kinds of behaviors. Plus, it requires that we assume that there are drives. And since drives can't be directly measured, objectively measured, then that's a pretty difficult task. They're unquantifiable. We might say, well, food, the longer you go without food, the hungrier you are. Well, that's not true. Sometimes we feel really hungry, and it hasn't been that long since we ate. And sometimes we go for a long time without eating, and we still feel okay. Or we feel fine until we smell food, and then we're like, oh yeah, I'm hungry, right? Like, the feeling of hunger is not directly correlated to how long it's been since we ate. So these drives then are really unquantifiable, which scientifically is a problem. So relative value theory is an attempt to explain reinforcement, but we have to do so from a different means. Relative value theory is also known as the Premack principle, as it was David Premack who developed it. And it requires us to reconceptualize reinforcers as behavior. So rather than thinking about reinforcers as stimuli, think about reinforcers as behavior. In other words, food isn't a reinforcer. Food is a stimulus, but it's not a reinforcer. Eating the food is the reinforcer. It's the eating of the food that reinforces the rat pressing the lever. Right? So, rat presses the lever, gets food. Food's not the reinforcer, it's that now the rat can eat the food. Right? That's the thing it's reinforcing, according to this approach. So, what relative value theory argues is that in any given situation, there are tons of things that we can do, but some of the things that we can do are more likely than others. Right? So, for a rat, if you gave a hungry rat, a pile of food and a lever to press, right? So they have free access to food and free access to a lever, then eating food is more likely than pressing the lever. If we were in a classroom, right, then you'd be much more likely to be sitting at your desk than you would be to just be wandering around class. You could wander around class, nobody's stopping you from doing it, but you're much more likely to go and sit down and do things seated at your desk as opposed to just wander around the classroom. So even though there are all these behaviors that are available, some of them are more likely than others. So from the relative value perspective then, behaviors have different relative values or probabilities. So when we say that one behavior is more likely than another, what we mean is that it has a higher probability or a higher relative value than another behavior. And the cool thing about this is that we can actually measure that, right? We can give access, or we can just observe. So here is this child at recess, and we can just watch what the child does, and we see that they go down, they're on the slide. Out of the 15 minutes, they're on the slide for 7 minutes, right? And then they're over on the swing for 3 minutes, and then they're running around randomly for another 2 minutes. And so we can look at all of these things that they do as they have free access and can determine the relative value of each of these behaviors for that child, right? We don't have to make any assumptions about drives or any sort of internal concepts, because we can just look at the behavior, and from what they do, we can describe and assign probabilities. And we would expect that, well, the next time they go out, they're probably going to still spend a lot of time on the slide and probably swing a little bit and run around a little bit, but the slide is the thing that they really like, right? That has a higher relative value. So the Premack principle then is that high probability behavior can reinforce low probability behavior. What that means is that we have this child that slides. They spend a lot of time on the slide. The slide has a high relative value. So if what we need is we would like for the child to do something else that it doesn't do very much, right? Maybe we want the child to throw the ball with another child a little bit. We want some interaction. But the child just doesn't throw the ball. It's not what they do. They don't throw the ball back and forth. But we want them to do that. We want them to engage in some social interaction. So we deprive them of the slide until they throw the ball with a friend. When they throw the ball back and forth, then they can get on the slide, right? So they gain access to the slide, this preferred activity, by doing a less preferred activity. So the sliding is a reinforcer, right? But it's the behavior of sliding that's the reinforcer, and it reinforces this lower probability behavior of throwing the ball with your friend. So let's give another example. If drinking water is a higher probability for a rat than running in the running wheel, and so given access to water and a running wheel, the rat spends more time drinking water than going on the running wheel, then what we can do is we can make access to water contingent on running. In other words, the rat has to run in order to gain access to the water. So running gives access to water, and what we would expect then is that the rat would run more so that it can gain access to the water, so that it can drink water. All right. Another example, if you have someone at your house and watching TV is something that they do much more than chores, dishes, etc., then if access to the TV is deprived until the chores are done, then TV can reinforce doing chores. Response deprivation theory is very similar to the relative value theory. It builds off of the idea of the Premack principle, but it takes it one step further and really completes it. So, similar to the Premack principle, relative value theory, it states that all behaviors occur at some frequency or have some probability, and it refers to that as the baseline level. So if we just look at how often someone does things, right? That's their baseline level. The child in the playground, we see how often he goes down slides and swings and plays with the ball and all these different things, right? That's the baseline level. The argument of response deprivation theory is that if access is restricted of any behavior below its baseline, then access to it can serve as a reinforcer. So in the example of the child, sliding was something that they did the majority of the time that they're on the playground, but they did swing also. And so if access, you could restrict access to the swing and make that contingent on doing something, and they will still work for the swing, for access to the swing as well. So let's give another example. Can running reinforce drinking? So we already talked about for this rat that drinking water is something that they do more than running, but they still run some. So what if we deprive access to the running wheel and make access dependent on drinking water? Now, they already drink water more than they run in the running wheel, but if we restrict access to the running wheel, unless they drink more water, can we make them drink more? And the answer is yes. When they drink, then they gain access to the running wheel, and away they go. Right? So we can see on the graph the time spent drinking when drinking was not reinforced. Then we see that they spent around 20 seconds per hour drinking. But if drinking was reinforced by running, something they already didn't do very much, but if you take running away from them, take that option away from them, now they'll drink more than normal just so that they can get access to running. Now, theories of negative reinforcement. So here we need to have a little bit of background on an experiment, the shuttle box escape avoidance task. So Solomon Wynn had a divided box. On one side of the box, the light is on. On the other side of the box, the light is off. They put a dog in on the side where the light was on. Then the lights switched, right? So the light turned off on the side the dog was on. The light turned on the other side. And 10 seconds after the light turned off, then an electrical current ran through the floor, shocking the dog. All right? But the dog could escape that by jumping to the other side. So the dog jumps to the other side where the light is on, gets away from the shock, right? And then that's repeated. So after they're there for a little while, then the light on that side turns off, the light on the other side turns on. 10 seconds later, a current is run through that side of the floor, and the dog can jump to the other side to escape the current. And before long, the dog starts to jump before or right when the light turns off, meaning that the dog doesn't get shocked anymore. And the question is, why? Right? Why does that happen? Well, that's the point of theories, is to explain behavior. So that's their question. Why is the dog jumping before the light turns off? How do we explain that? Well, there are two theories. First, the two-process theory is one that involves both Pavlovian and operant conditioning. And so we need to talk about a Pavlovian component and an operant conditioning component. So Pavlovian first. According to the Pavlovian component of this explanation, when the light turns off, that is a CS, that's an event, right? That's a stimulus, a conditioned stimulus that gets paired with shock. Light turns off, shock follows the light turning off. Shock produces pain, but it also produces a fear response in the dog. So that's the CS, US, UR with the fear. After repeated pairings, when the light turns off, that elicits a fear response in the dog, right? So just standard Pavlovian conditioning right there. Essentially, by the light turning off, followed by shock, it's making the dog afraid of the dark. Okay? The operant part is that when the light turns off, that's the stimulus, that's the context, right? And so when the light turns off, jumping to the other side where the light is on reduces fear, right? Because now they're on the side where the light is on, and where the light is on, they've never been shocked. Okay? So jumping away from where the light is off reduces fear. So those are the two parts. We have the Pavlovian part and the operant part. The operant part is really escape. It's escaping a fear stimulus. So from that perspective, although the dog arguably is avoiding shock, what it's really doing, what's really motivating the behavior, is that it's escaping the dark. Now, let's test out this idea. Prediction, then. If we look at the latency to jump, so the amount of time, how long it takes for dogs to jump across trials, and the dotted line here represents the time when the shock would turn on. So right in the corner of the latency and time bars, that's 0, right? But as we go up, then where that dotted line is, that's 10 seconds. Okay? And so the prediction is that on the first couple of trials, the dogs are going to be in the dark long enough to get shocked. And so they'll have the light off, followed by shock, right? And then eventually they'll jump to the other side. So light off, shock, jump. But eventually they'll learn and they will jump before they get shocked. Now the question is, what happens next? If the light off is followed by a conditioned fear response, but jumping reduces fear and avoids getting a shock, then what that means is that the light turning off is not followed by shock anymore, right? Those are extinction trials. So what should happen then is that the dog should, because of Pavlovian extinction, slow down its jump until it gets shocked a few more times, and then jump sooner on the next trials, and then slow them down again. Essentially what we should see is that the dog should get shocked from time to time as they go through this experiment. But as it turns out, that's not what happens. Instead, once the dogs learn to avoid the shock, they continue to do that, and the experimenters can turn the shock generators off, and the dogs will never stay in the dark long enough to find out if they're still on. They just continue to jump. So this escape behavior is incredibly persistent. That's fascinating, but the issue here is that the two-process theory, although it sounds like a good theory, doesn't actually explain the behavior. So, avoidance behavior, very persistent, does not extinguish. One process theory involves operant conditioning only. Right? So here we're looking at escape and avoidance being reinforced by a reduction in aversive stimulation. That's the basic idea. So how can avoidance be a reinforcer? Good question. What does that mean? Well, if we successfully avoid something, that means that nothing happens. Well, how can something that did not happen be a reinforcer? It's kind of a logical puzzle here. If you successfully avoid, nothing happens. How can something that didn't happen be a reinforcer? I mean, after all, there are things not happening all the time. If they didn't happen, that means they're not events. That means they can't have any impact on anything, right? Well, we need to think about it in terms instead of avoidance being a reduction in exposure to shock. And the way we get to this is by adjusting the experiment a little bit. So Herrnstein and Heinlein put rats in a chamber, an operant chamber with a lever, and the floor could be electrified. All right. So rather than have the rats jump back and forth like in the shuttle box, instead they had a lever they could press. Right. And if they pressed the lever at a steady rate, they would still get shocked about every 20 seconds. It was random, so it wasn't exactly every 20 seconds, but on average, every 20 seconds they would get shocked. So if they press the lever at a steady rate, they get shocked. But if they stopped pressing the lever, then they got shocked on average every 7 seconds. As you might suspect, the rats press the lever at a very high rate. Alright? So what that tells us then is that it's not about fear or anything like that, but instead that negative reinforcement works because animals work to reduce exposure to aversive stimuli. Reducing exposure is reinforcing. So to summarize, the law of effect states that there's a relationship between the situation, the behavior, and the consequences. In a particular situation, certain behavior produces certain consequences, such that it's a three-term contingency. Voluntary behavior is affected by its consequences. We have voluntary in quotes there because, well, if it's affected by its consequences, then we're coming at this from a deterministic perspective, and so voluntary kind of has a different meaning. Primary reinforcers are these things that are innately reinforcing, important to our survival, like food and water and sex, etc. Whereas conditioned reinforcers are things that have been paired with primary reinforcers. We discussed the importance of contiguity, the immediacy of reinforcers, of consequences. Immediate consequences are stronger. And we discussed the importance of contingency, that relationship between behavior and response, that once a consequence occurs in the absence of a response, then doing that behavior, that response, decreases. And then finally we discussed the theories of both positive and negative reinforcement, discussing the Premack principle and the response deprivation theory of reinforcement, as well as the one-process theory of operant reinforcement for escape and avoidance. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you.